Bulavanaka, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Clea Farrow. I'm the Protected Areas Officer here working on the BIOPAMA program. Just wanted to show you my face. Welcome, Ala Ferretti. I'm just going to take my video off now and we'll just stick with the audio and the presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. We're here to talk about the Action Component Rapid Response Grant. I'll be doing a very brief overview of the BIOPAMA program, and then we'll jump straight into the rules and requirements for the grant. Okay, so here is a list of the topics that we're going to cover today. As I mentioned, very brief overview of the BIOPAMA program, and then we'll jump into the purpose and objectives of the Rapid Response Grant. Eligibility, so we'll look at the eligible entities, countries and project locations. We'll discuss budget, so eligible and ineligible costs, and some of the key components of the proposal or your application, which are the environment and social management system and the log frame. And then right at the end, I'll just talk really briefly about the evaluation criteria, which should help you frame your proposals. So the Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program is an initiative of the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States. So we've just had a name change just very recently. They were formerly known as the ACP Group of States. So the program is financed by the European Union's 11th European Development Fund. It's a €60 million investment to improve the long-term conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and natural resources. So globally, the program's implemented in a partnership. IUCN provides the protected areas and biodiversity expertise, and the European Commission Joint Research Centre kind of brings the scientific and technical know-how to the program. So it's running until 2023 at this stage, and it's IUCN's biggest program in terms of the budget. So this is just a map of the scope of the program. You can see it runs in a number of regions. We've got the Caribbean, Central and Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and Eastern and Southern Africa, and the Pacific here. So in the Pacific region, BIOPAMA is implemented under the Protected and Conserved Area program through IUCN's Oceania Regional Office. And IUCN leads the implementation in partnership with the Joint Research Centre and SPREP. So obviously today we're talking about the action component, the grant facility, but there are just a few other parts to the program we just wanted to briefly touch on just for your broader awareness. Many of you will have heard of the PIP app. So that is the housed by SPREP. It's a Pacific Islands Protected Area Portal. So it's essentially an online protected area resource and data hub. We're also doing specific support and training, so working with partners on a range of topics to enhance protected area management in the region. And we're developing the first comprehensive review and analysis of the status and issues of protected areas in the region through the SOPACA reports, the State of Protected and Conserved Area reports. Okay, just a snapshot on the different grant types we've had so far. So today we're talking about the Rapid Response Grants. We've also run a call for proposals for medium grants and small technical grants. So the Rapid Response Grants are, as you can see, the smallest, so they're up to €50,000 and they can run for up to 12 months. I just wanted to introduce you to our Pacific Action Component team. Just on the right there, you can see the 15 independent states of the region. So that includes Timor-Leste. Those are the countries where the grant is operating. And then here's our team on the left. So we have on the top left there is Carol Martinez. She's the Senior Grants Manager. And next to her on the top right there is Anna Rosenberg, who is our Senior Grants Finance Manager. So these colleagues are based in Switzerland, and they oversee the grant implementation in all the regions, but we work very closely with them here in the Pacific. Then on the bottom row there, we've got Paul van Nimwegen on the left, and he's the BIOPAMA coordinator for the Pacific. So he looks after the implementation of BIOPAMA, all its components in the Pacific region. Then we have Ananta Singh and Anjani Gosai, who are our finance colleagues, and that's me, Clea Farrow, on the right there. And I'm primarily supporting grantees through all parts of the process. So the rules and criteria of the grants are designed by IUCN in close consultation with the donor, with the EU. And our role here in the region is to support you to apply and then implement your project. But the grants themselves will be managed by headquarters, our headquarters. So for instance, the funds would be dispersed directly from Switzerland to your bank account. They won't come via the regional office. But on a day-to-day basis, the regional team is the team that you'll be working with more closely if you're successful, and in your preparation for your to lodge your proposal. Okay, so this is a screenshot of the portal, the action component portal. You probably will have had a look at this already, but this is kind of the go-to website for all the information about the grant. In the top right-hand corner there, you can see I've circled the login box. So you'll need to create a profile, an online login, and that's how you lodge your application, and that's where you find all the relevant information. The websites are just listed there. There's the general BIOPAMA action component website, and then there's a special page for the rapid response grants. And just a note, if you're having any trouble accessing this website, maybe try using the Mozilla or Chrome browsers, because for some reason it doesn't seem to like Internet Explorer. We worked that out last time. Okay, just a snapshot of all the available information. I'd say, your first port of call should be the portal and then talking to us, but these documents are essential. So probably the most important one to point you to is the guidelines for the grant. So on the left side there, that's just a screenshot of the front page of those. I attach them to the calendar invitation and they're available on the portal, but I would strongly encourage you to read that document from cover to cover before you start. The other useful information sources are the BIOPAMA indicators, so that spreadsheet just in the middle at the bottom there. This is to help design your log frame, and we can talk to you more about this if you're successful. We also have an environmental and social management system guide for applicants, and there's also the procurement policy. So before you spend any money, you need to be familiar with the rules and requirements around that. So let's jump into the purpose of the grant, and apologies, there's too many words on this slide, so apologies for that. The purpose is to respond to the risks and difficulties for priority areas and surrounding communities induced by COVID-19. So this list here is some examples of risks and difficulties that we're already aware of or that we've anticipated, but that's not an exhaustive list, just to kind of give you an idea of the types of problems we think our stakeholders might be facing as a result of the pandemic. Examples might include reducing the budget to manage protected areas, economic consequences for staff, maybe staff being let go. We might see increase in particular environmental crimes if there's fewer people on the ground, patrolling and monitoring protected sites. Those are the kind of difficulties we're anticipating. But a real key message here is that applications should respond to emergency situations needing rapid action rather than proposing programmatic action on long-standing issues. So we've got 3 specific objectives for this grant. In your application form, you'll be asked to select one of them. So your project idea, might help support all 3, but whatever's the most appropriate or I guess the most closely aligned is the one that you select. And they are enhanced management and governance of protected or conserved areas, increased resilience to major shocks, and recovery of protected areas, including maybe through innovative or sustainable funding plans, and maintaining livelihoods or enhancing resilience of local communities to major shocks. So this is just a snapshot of some key facts of the grant. There's a €2 million envelope set aside for this round, and that's for all regions. There's no, as far as I know, there's no nominated amount per allocated to each region. It's just, it's a rolling grant. It's just as the proposals come in, they'll be assessed on merit and the money will be dispersed that way. So the maximum you can apply for is up to €50,000. No co-financing is required, so that means BIOPAMA will provide 100% of the total eligible costs of the project. There's no minimum project length, but they can't go for longer than 12 months. Submissions need to be made electronically through the portal. So unfortunately, we can't receive emails or snail mail. And this call is a little bit different from the others. It's open-ended. So the deadline is the 31st of September, but you can lodge your application anytime between now and then. Sorry, 31st of December. Okay. So activities must be in one of these 15 countries, and they are the 14 independent Pacific states and Timor-Leste. So who is eligible? You must be, or your organisation must be a private or public entity registered as a discrete legal entity in an ACP country where you want to do the project. So you also need to be already involved in the management, governance, and or community livelihoods of the targeted priority area. So essentially, we want to see that you have a history of working in that site and you have relationships with the affected stakeholders, or we'll need to see a support letter from the management authority that shows us that they're aware of your proposal and they support your project, and that you have a kind of a mandate to be there. Also, you need to be directly responsible for preparing and managing the grant, not acting as an intermediary. If I don't think this applies to anyone in the meeting now, but if you've been funded by the EU for the same activities, then you can't apply for this funding, and nor can you be an individual or sole trader. So this is a list of, it's again not exhaustive, but a list of the types of organisations that are eligible. If after this presentation there's any confusion or it's still a little unclear, just get in touch with us and we'll look at your particular circumstances and help work out whether you're eligible or not. But government entities are eligible to apply at any level. National and local NGOs, CBOs, registered, protected and conserved areas, and even small to medium for-profit enterprises. So the threshold there is having 5 to 10 permanent staff and an annual balance or turnover of less than €2 million. There's an exception for organisations based in OECD countries. They're eligible to apply if they are working in one of the 5 least developed countries in the Pacific. And those are Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Okay, the location criteria is quite broad. We use the phrase priority areas, so it's broader than more protected or conserved areas, and includes community conservation areas, key biodiversity areas, marine managed areas, or even proposed protected areas. If obviously the IUCN, official IUCN BIOPAMA partners can't apply for this grant, nor can organisations who have relatives or close friends associated with those partners. IUCN member organisations are eligible to apply. We just need to be confident that there's structural and legal independence from IUCN. So because this grant amount is relatively small, we're not anticipating too many formal partnerships like this, but if you want to work with another organisation in an official kind of capacity, then you can apply as lead applicant with a co-applicant. If that's the case, then your co-applicant will need to meet all the same eligibility criteria, but the lead applicant is the main contact point and is responsible for implementing the grant. There are a few limits. So you can submit up to 2 proposals as a lead or co-applicant per call per region, but we'll only fund one of those. So if both your proposals get above the score threshold required, then the one that scores the most highly will be recommended for funding and the other one won't. There's also a rule that entities that have been awarded a medium grant or a small technical grant as a lead applicant can't also get a rapid response grant. So there are a couple of our stakeholders who maybe not in the meeting now, but who might be affected by this rule. So we just say get in touch with us and we can have a chat to you about that situation. This is a list of basically principles for the activities. They are required, but it's kind of a way to frame it, I guess. So obviously your activities need to be consistent with the objectives that we discussed earlier. They need to address emergencies from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll talk about what constitutes an emergency next. We need to see tangible results within 12 months. Need to comply with our environmental and social safeguards framework. We need an agreement that you'll share any information or data generated by the project with us, and that will be uploaded into the PIPA for future use by other practitioners. Obviously, it has to be cost efficient and sustainable, practical and time limited. So not too ambitious. You know, you have to be able to get it all done within the 12 months. So let's move on to defining an emergency situation. So to be eligible, actions must address an emergency situation or enhanced threat to biodiversity or community livelihood due to the pandemic. So really, ongoing issues, even though they're still very important, are not the focus of this grant call. So there's kind of an emergency test, I guess you could call it, that will help us determine which projects to fund. So there are 3 components to that, or three criteria. The first is urgency. So we'll only consider emergency situations that have arisen in the last few months due to the pandemic, or if an existing threat has suddenly intensified. So if in your proposal you can share with us details or evidence of the emergency or recent threat increase, that will strengthen your application. So for example, that might include an official emergency declaration, employment termination letters, income statements, or visitor records, showing that numbers have dropped off. The second criterion there is time sensitivity. So we'll be prioritizing projects that need immediate help. And the third is duration and reversibility of impact. So we're going to try and focus on actions that will avert irreversible damage or reduce long-term negative impacts. And then on top of all that, if your activities will also lead to kind of co-benefits beyond conservation, they'll be favoured too. So for example, having a positive impact on community livelihoods, maybe some climate change mitigation or adaptation benefits, or collaborating with young professionals. There's some examples that are listed in the guidelines. So I'll just touch on eligible and ineligible activities, and then we can pause for questions so far. So this is a list of eligible activities. Again, not exhaustive. Page 6 of the guidelines has a lot more detail here, but I've just listed the key ones for you here. So, for example, with anti-poaching operations, you might want to maintain or increase patrolling. You might want to purchase a truck or boat for protected area surveillance. You might need equipment for better communications, such as two-way radios, mobile phones, radars. You might want to better mark your protected area boundary, so you might need to purchase buoys or fences or erect signboards. There's activities related to sustainable livelihoods. So for communities living in and around priority areas who might have suffered income loss from the pandemic, activities that promote alternative income streams or improve access to basic needs will be welcome. So, for example, small-scale community-based aquaculture, agriculture, apiculture, agroforestry, just as small-scale investments. And just on the last two there, we're also supporting site assessments. So if you want to assess the management or governance effectiveness of a protected area, or you want to do a bit of a stock take of the economic or social settings, then those activities are in scope as well. Okay, I might pause. Oh, actually, no. Let me just touch on ineligible activities, and then we'll go to questions. So this is a pretty standard list. This hasn't changed from grant to grant for us. So this is pretty straightforward. You can't do things that might displace people, affect vulnerable groups, damage cultural property, use harmful pesticides. Pretty obvious things there. Okay, before we move on to the financial side of it, with budgets and all that fun stuff, does anybody have any questions for me? There's none typed there, so if not, I'll just move on. Otherwise, please speak up.
Hi, hello, hello, Claire. Thank you for the outline of the proposal and the eligible activities. I'm just acknowledging here that some of the communities in Fiji also went through Harold.
Oh yeah.
Harold cyclone, and I mean, on top of the COVID-19, yeah? How does that fit in to this proposal or this call?
Yep, that's a good question. We did actually, it was certainly considered whether we would expand emergency, beyond just the COVID pandemic and look at other natural disasters. But the decision was made to keep the scope a little bit more narrow. But if those communities have faced the same problem through both those disasters, then they'll probably still meet that emergency test. So we could talk to you about, maybe the impacts originated from TC Harold and then were compounded by the pandemic. So there could still be a case there for the activity to be funded, but that obviously depends on what it is you want to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, Sammy's got a question there about the time frame for hearing back. Yep, that's a good question. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but we're looking at hopefully a 6-week turnaround. So the ideal would be, but from the day that you submit your proposal, you'll have an answer within 6 weeks, and then we move to contracting as quickly as possible. Okay, another question here. Yes, about already. Okay, so there's a question about whether you're eligible if you're already accessing EU funding. So just to clarify that, if you've been funded by the EU for the same activities in the same place, then basically we're trying to prevent double dipping there. But I think if you've been funded by the EU to do something else somewhere else, that's fine. It's more about not not having too much going on in the same place. Okay, if there are no more questions, we might move on, and then we'll have another chat at the end as well. So let's move on to budget. Just a bit of a snapshot of our financial settings. So no co-financing is required, which I mentioned earlier. We'll need to know that you have sufficient financial and operational capacity to implement the project. So the way we will work this out is by asking you to fill out a due diligence questionnaire. And that's just a series of questions about your organisation to show us that you have the right systems and processes in place to implement the grant successfully. There's a couple of options for your costings in your budget. They are the real cost option, which most people are familiar with, and there's another option called the simplified cost option, which I'll talk about in a minute. The management fee is capped, or the what's the word? Management fee is capped at 7%. Indirect costs, that's the phrase I was looking for, and that's a strict EU rule, so we can't go above 7%. And we can't have sub-granting. So you can subcontract out particular parts of your project to organisations who might be experts in that activity, but you can't take the grant and give the whole thing to a third party to implement on your behalf. So technical and financial reporting will be needed for all project costs as well. Okay, so eligible costs are pretty straightforward. Human resources is fine, so that's salaries including entitlements, travel and associated costs, for example, per diems, vehicles, equipment and supplies that you need for the project, local office costs and other costs and services, so costs derived from subcontracts. And as I touched on earlier, all purchases need to align with our procurement policy. So depending on how much you want to spend, there's different, checks in place. So you might need to get 3 quotes, or you might need to do a formal terms of reference or go out to tender. So you'll need to be quite familiar with that policy before you spend any money. Ineligible costs, again, pretty standard list here. The 2 things I wanted to point out are that renting or leasing is not eligible, and that's because we want a lasting impact, not a temporary impact. And also for government salaries, we can't fund ongoing government positions, but if new roles or activities are created for the project, then we can fund those. So for example, if you recruit someone for 6 months in a brand new role that's fully funded by BIOPAMA, then that's fine. Okay, this is the budget spreadsheet. It's simpler than our last version, which is great. It's basically just this first tab. There's a second tab there, which looks like this, which is just an example, and it shows you how to fill it out. It's quite useful, but all the important information needs to just go on this first tab here. So there are a series of footnotes which have further explanation and direction for you. And just particularly wanted to draw your attention to the justification column on the right there. That's where you explain to us what you want to buy, what you want to spend the money on and why, and how you came up with that figure. So if you have too much information there and it's not fitting in that column, you can write it in a Word document and upload it into the portal. It doesn't have to be in that column, but yeah, you can start there, I guess. So the budget needs to be in euros, and you also need to tell us what conversion rate you're using and on what date, and we suggest you use the same conversion rate for all your figures. That's just the example, which is in the spreadsheet. I attached that to the calendar invitation, but that's also available to download on the portal from the portal. Okay, so just briefly on the costing options. I guess before I go into this description, I'll say we'll talk to you about this if you're successful. We can have more discussions about which options you want to use. But just to give you a brief description of them. The real cost option is the one that you'll all be familiar with, and that's where you estimate your costs and enter them into the budget, and then we reimburse you based on your actual expenditure. The downside to this approach is that it's got a very high administrative burden for both parties, because every single euro that you spend needs to be tracked and justified with paperwork, so receipts and various other forms of evidence. The simplified cost option tries to reduce that burden, and it does that by agreeing on the cost up front before it's been spent. So you will say to us, we think this signboard will cost 100 euros, erecting these signboards, and we've got a quote to do that, or we've done it before and this is how much it cost last time. So we'll agree on that cost, and then that's what we'll pay. Whether it ends up costing a bit more or a bit less when you do it, you'll still get that 100 euros once you've achieved the output, so you've bought and erected the signboards. So it reduces the administrative burden because we don't require all this evidence when you actually spend the money. For the time being, in your budget, we just say try to make the budget as realistic and cost effective as you can. And if you're shortlisted, then we'll talk to you about which of your costs you might want to use the real cost option for, the simplified cost option for. So for the time being, just keep that in the back of your mind and just focus on putting together a realistic budget. Okay, all IUCN projects are screened for potential negative environmental or social impacts. And to help us do this screening, we have the framework called the Environmental and Social Management System. I'm not going to talk about it too much now, but the framework of it is 8 overarching principles and 4 standards. And these are basically to try and reduce any potential negative impacts, for example, on Indigenous peoples, customary landholders, maybe through access restrictions, negative impacts on biodiversity or cultural heritage. So in your application form, there's a series of questions that are about the environmental and social management system. So you'll need to answer them in the original initial application form, and then if you're shortlisted and we want to fund you, we'll ask you to fill out a more detailed questionnaire. But that bit comes later, which is good, just simplifies the project a little bit. So when we're assessing your proposals, we'll use the answers in here to help us work out the risk profile. So it's really important for us that you provide as much detail as you can. We're not saying that you can't do things if there's a risk that there might be negative impacts. It's more that we just want to be aware of what those risks are, see if they can be avoided and mitigated. So, for example, if you want to better enforce access restrictions or construct physical barriers, that might restrict people's access to land or natural resources and impact on their livelihoods. Or if you want to clear a walking track or a road through a park, you might need to clear some native vegetation. So we just want to know what the potential impacts are, and then I guess we'll go from there. So the other component of the application is a log frame. This is done in the portal. So there's a lot more guidance on how to develop a log frame in the application form, but it'll be on the portal. You can see there in the image there's 3 components. The log frame is the second one. That's why it's circled with the red there. And that's where you will enter your expected results. So that's the tangible results the project will deliver. So an example of a result is that a protected area boundary is monitored. You'd also enter your indicator. So that's how you judge how you have achieved your results. So an example of an indicator might be the number of patrols that you'll be doing per month or per year. We have some BIOPAMA kind of program-wide indicators that we'd like for you to include a couple of, and you can also write your own indicators. But we can talk to you about that when you're developing your proposal, and more even if you're successful. You also enter your baseline. So you'd say, for example, in 2020 there are 0 patrols, but your target might be that by the end of 2021 there's 2 patrols a month, so 24 patrols. And then in your verification section, that's how we know you've done what you've done, I guess is a simple way to say it. So you might have ranger patrol logs or photos that the rangers take, or activity reports from their patrols. So that's they're all the components, I guess, of the application package. This here is a summary of what you need to submit. So we've got the general information section at the front of the portal, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And that's just kind of your background information about your organisation and your project. Then a key part is obviously the application form, and that's a Word document that you download and you fill out and you re-upload. There's the log frame, which is done in the portal, which we just talked about. Your budget, which is the Excel spreadsheet that you download and fill out and re-upload. The due diligence questionnaire, so that's how we look at your organisation's capacity to deliver the grant. And then there's a declaration form, and then all your supporting documents. So the supporting documents would be, for instance, your organisation's registration certificate, CVs of your project staff, maybe if you've had consultation reports from previous consultations at the site, annual reports, corporate policies, or quotes or other evidence to justify your costings. So this is just the general information section in the portal. It's not too complicated. That's all pretty straightforward information there. Then there's a second part of the portal, which is the log frame. And then the third part is the document upload section. So this is where you go to, firstly, to get the documents you need to fill out, and then you upload, for instance, the application form once you've filled it out, and any other supporting documents as well. And at the bottom, it didn't quite fit in the slide here, but at the bottom you can add extra documents, so there's no limit on the number of documents you can upload. Okay, we're nearly finished. Just wanted to lastly talk about the evaluation grid. So this is to give you a sense of how the proposals are assessed. There's a possible maximum score of 35 points, and any proposals that score over 21 points will be submitted to the BIOPAMA Action Component Validating Committee to make the final decision. So you can see here in the list that the emergency test is quite important. There's 10 points allocated to that. So it's really important to spend time explaining the context in your problem to us. Then there's 5 points for all the rest of the categories, which include how relevant your activities are, your technical capacity, your budget, I guess the coherence and strength of your budget, whether your activities are sustainable, and how you've responded to any environmental or social risks that your project might create. This is the I guess the proposal cycle. So the short version of that is, once you submit it online, the regional teams do the evaluation. So that's our team in the Pacific. So we'll screen all the proposals and assess them based on that evaluation grid and allocate a score. And then our proposals that reach over 21 will be submitted to the validating committee to decide whether they're funded. And that committee is made up of donor representatives, so representatives from the European Commission and the ACP group of states. Once that decision's made, they'll let us know, and then we'll get in contact with you, and then move on to maybe making a few tweaks to your proposal and then contracting. So that's about it for now. I've just listed here again the Action Component website, And then in bold there, you can see the biopama.ac.info email address. That one, that goes to our whole team. So if you use that, I'll get that one, and so will my colleague Paul and our other colleagues too. So I would recommend contacting us using that one. And if you have any more questions about eligibility or you want help developing your proposal, that's what we're here for. So please get in contact with us